I don't think it's too out there to claim that the past decade of gaming is one of scrutiny, extremism, and all-around clickbait. When a game drops, the first thing everyone seems to want to know is if it was an absolute banger or a complete train wreck. Mega threads drown the internet with links to reviews from across the World Wide Web to determine how you should feel about a game before you even decide to purchase it, and in many cases before it's even released to the public. And while there are many upsides to these reviews in helping you to determine whether you should spend your hard-earned dollars, there are arguably just as many cons in the system that can potentially turn you away from an otherwise inoffensive at worst experience. All of this is made worse by the fact that games are simply just not released in a completed state anymore. And often, you'll find a game significantly more enjoyable if you jump into the deluxe or completed edition a few years later. The issue, however, is by then, the hype has died down and the hate train has left the station. Video game releases, as such, have become a time-sensitive event where many questions are asked. Is it any good? Will it win Game of the Year? Should they have delayed it longer? Why is it still so bad despite all of these delays? How can they charge X amount of dollars for this game? Why is it considered a sequel when it could have just been a DLC? These are all valid questions that I won't discredit, even if some of them are often out of place or downright unnecessary at times. And the worst part of it all is they often come with baggage and set a narrative in place that, while it could be accurate, often feels completely exaggerated. An example of this in full effect occurred for me back in 2017 when I purchased and downloaded Sonic Forces. I had it ready to go on my console and I figured I'd eventually get to it. It sat on my home menu just staring at me every time I scrolled past it to play another game. I didn't expect to put it off. The timing of the game's release just wasn't the best time, and every review I read or video I watched on YouTube about the game made me figure that if I was going to play this game, I'd have to be in the mood to play it. As more time passed, more games released. Sonic Forces fell further and further down in the pecking order until all of a sudden one day I figured it was taking up too much space on my dashboard, and was an unnecessary waste of memory, so I deleted it. While many modern gamers view Sonic Forces as the lowest point in the series, largely because they might have not been around during the seemingly million of other lowest points, for me it might have been the actual lowest point in gaming. Because I didn't even play the game. I had purchased a game, starring one of my favorite mascots ever, and proceeded to delete it without feeling any regret and just a little bit of remorse for the franchise. As you might be aware, this video was the start of my retrospective in reverse of the 3D Sonic series. After playing Sonic Frontiers, I decided I'd immediately jump into Forces, largely because I wanted more Sonic, but also because I wanted to see just how bad this game actually was in comparison to Frontiers, since Frontiers seems to have been generally positively released, whereas Forces, well, it's been beaten to death. I wanted to understand not only what made Frontiers such a vast improvement in the previous game series, but I also wanted to experience just how horrible of an experience the previous game was. For half a decade, I've heard people complaining about the inclusion of certain characters, a story that seems to not gel very well, and stages that all around seem to play far too easily. I wanted to see if Forces, after 5 years, 2 successful movies, a pretty good sequel, and all around positive vibes by the fanbase, was going to be a game I enjoyed. And I think it's important to stress the I part. I haven't played all of the 3D Sonic games. In fact, I've barely touched any of the Boost era games, and I've played little to no 3D Sonic games at all in the past decade. A few years ago I ran through adventure games and Heroes, but it wasn't with a critical lens, and I played it on Dolphin on my cell phone with touch controls, which isn't really the optimal experience. The reason I'm stressing this is because I think I'm coming in with a fairly pure angle, not hindered by reused assets or changes in control sensitivity and whatnot, so I hope you're ready. This is my first time playthrough review of Sonic Forces in 2023. I don't really know how everyone feels about Sonic stories that take themselves too seriously, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit they weren't my guilty pleasure. A big reason I enjoyed Frontiers was the somber atmosphere and the attempt at making Sonic feel a sense of loneliness. I stress attempt because, as you all know, Sonic was all about remaining positive, and you can see it in his body language. That's why, right off the bat in the start of Sonic Forces, seeing Sonic get defeated garnered an eyebrow raise from me and piqued my interest. You can't simply make Sonic lose a fight and gloss over it. You need to back it up. With the fall of Sonic, Eggman can take over the entire world, and does so within 6 months, which drastically stresses how significant Sonic is for the balance of the world against the evil Doctor. Lots of people like to criticize the fact that Sonic's friends couldn't avenge him, or the fact that Sonic was defeated at all, and even more people like to criticize the fact that Tails whimpered at the loss of Sonic because he's had such growth over the series. But I guess I don't really have any issues with it, in part because I don't think any of this is meant to be scrutinized to this extent. It's a children's story and certain characters fit certain character tropes better than others. But I also don't really ascribe to the criticism because I think it discredits just how strong and powerful both Sonic and Eggman are. Without Sonic, the hero, the world can and will fall, if the evil is led by Eggman. He's only seen as a bumbling buffoon because Sonic keeps him in check, otherwise he'd essentially be a dictator, as shown time and again. Sonic's friends play a critical role in many of his endeavors against Eggman, but Sonic is still the most important piece of the puzzle. In any case, back to the story. Knuckles has moved to gathering forces of resistance that want to defeat this new Eggman-led dystopia. All the usual Sonic friends are there, and they all seem to encourage each other as the story plays out, whether it's through a cutscene or a text box. I like how generally positive everyone seems to be, and the general idea of a Sonic story involving a revolution is not new. If you haven't already, you should probably watch Sonic Prime on Netflix. Don't worry, no spoilers here, I just really enjoyed Sonic Prime. Part of this force is a new member of the team. Hey guys, it's Dean, the bear. The story continues and Dean eventually rescues Sonic. Sonic, who is optimistic and lively as ever, as he should be, is delighted to meet with the rookie and looks to be in top condition to restore balance to the forces. While Sonic is being saved, Tails is also out and about trying to do his part where he gets attacked by Chaos and gets saved by Classic Sonic. I don't know if it's worth discussing Classic Sonic. If his inclusion and backstory bother you, then there's probably nothing I can really say to change your mind. I personally don't really care. I always thought separating Classic Sonic and Modern Sonic was weird enough as it was. But regarding this game specifically, Classic Sonic just came from a different dimension through a wormhole from Sonic Mania, which was just Sega's sad attempt at connecting the two games. Together, Classic Sonic and Tails gather intel on Eggman and learn about the Phantom Ruby, and Eggman's plan to destroy the Resistance in 3 days. Meanwhile, Modern Sonic figures out all of these bad guys with Eggman are obviously fake illusions created by Infinite. I'm not sure what the general consensus is of this guy, but I think he's super cool looking and has a sinister voice. He makes for a good bad guy in my opinion. I like his general design, even if his backstory is a little weak. Tails gets the information he needs to destroy the Phantom Ruby, which is the source of Infinite's powers. Dean creates a diversion allowing Classic Sonic to destroy the Death Egg, which would render the Phantom Ruby useless. What follows is, well, I'll let the cutscene do the talking.
Let's go! Go! Take this!
Now look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this is award-winning or anything. But come on, the general vibe of a full-on resistance attack heading into battle against the bad guys is pretty cool if not mildly epic. What follows of course is absurd, but I frickin' love the absurdity. Similar to the absurdity of Eggman blowing up the moon or the Earth being disconnected and unleashed or whatever, Infinite creates a giant sun using the power of the Phantom Ruby and decides to drop it on the entire Resistance in an attempt to destroy them. And naturally, even though it makes little to no sense, Dean is somehow the chosen one, and the only person able to use the prototype Phantom Ruby to eventually destroy the sun and save the Resistance. Again, this whole part of the story just kind of falls into place. Actually, you could say that from the start to end, but it doesn't really bother me. Like, I don't know what to tell you, most of the Sonic stories are just as ridiculous and absurd, and that's why I enjoyed them. If you're looking for a better story that flows properly, then you're probably better off playing a AAA PlayStation title with a game built around a story, rather than a Sonic game that has a story built around the game. Next, you'd have the defeat of Infinite at the hands of Sonic and Dean, as well as the defeat of Eggman's newest large concoction, which, I'm not going to lie, really challenged me. I actually really enjoyed the final boss battles in this game, and the rest of the battles as well. I'm pretty sure at least a handful of them were stolen from previous games, but I don't really have an issue with reused boss battles in a game released almost 10 years later. Also, this is a retrospective in reverse, so if that's a criticism to the series, I'll bring it up in a later video. Anyway, as far as the story goes, I enjoyed it enough. I didn't get super sucked into it like I would in Sonic Adventure 2 for example, but I'm also not 12 anymore. It's enough of a story to keep me focused while playing through the game, and an interesting enough premise that I think makes the game unique when it comes to Sonic stories. It probably could have done better with more cutscenes and less text boxes, but for a $40 3D speed platformer, I'm okay with what we got. So, the music, well, I mean you can tell it's a Sonic game. I found myself bobbing my head and jamming along with the game as I progressed. And the songs complemented the stages they were a part of. Nothing really stuck out to me as groundbreaking, which is rare for a Sonic game. But in the same vein, I don't think any of it didn't do the series justice. While some of the character models and cutscenes looked like they could use some polish, during actual gameplay, I had little to no issues with the aesthetics. I honestly couldn't even count how many times over the years I've heard someone claim that Sonic Forces stages were bland. But playing through this game, I was taken aback by just how good it looked. I think that's more of a reflection of myself though. I'm pretty tolerant when it comes to these things, probably because I spend most of my time playing old games. But I thought a lot of this game looked much better than it was given credit for. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that the stages in the game looked better than the ones in Sonic Frontiers' cyberspace levels. Which is probably more of a critique of Frontiers than a compliment for Forces, but I digress. All told, when it comes to the looks and sound of this game during the actual gameplay, I didn't really have any gripes. I even enjoyed some of the dialogue, regardless of how cringy and lame others might view it as. I'm just a sucker for it, what can I say? Okay, I feel the need to once again reiterate before I continue, but A, this is a retrospective in reverse, so I'm trying to do my best to not compare certain elements of the games to the ones from previous titles, and B, I legitimately have not played a Boost-era Sonic game in over a decade, if at all. So please have that in mind when I say that I didn't have any issues with the way Sonic controlled or boosted in this game. Sonic's movements felt similar enough to Frontiers, and even better in some instances. In many of the 2D sections of Frontiers, Sonic felt a bit heavy, almost like he'd drop quickly. It didn't bother me a whole lot because the cyberspace wasn't the focus of Frontiers, but in this game I was pleased when I saw that it wasn't that much of an issue. In fact, Sonic's control and forces all around felt easier to adapt to than it did in Frontiers. I also actually like that you have the 2D sections for both modern and classic Sonic. I've often seen people complain about having modern Sonic in 2D, but I disagree. The two characters control fundamentally different. Remember in Super Mario Maker 2 when they added elements from 3D World and slapped them into a 2D plane? They didn't need to do that because you already had the new Super Mario Bros. Style. But the reality was that 3D World controls varied enough that even if both styles were in 2D, they'd still feel different. I had the same feeling here. It was actually pretty cool to get modern Sonic's moves on a 2D plane and allowed me to approach the level differently, and likewise with Dean's controls on a 2D plane. Classic Sonic isn't Classic Sonic because he's in 2D. It's because his moveset differs. What really would have been cool though would be if we got Classic Sonic with his moveset in a 3D plane. It'd be interesting to see how that would work. But all in all, I liked how modern Sonic controlled. My biggest issue though was in the 2D sections not having as much control over Sonic's momentum, especially in the Classic section. I don't feel it's necessarily ruined the experience. I could always play and enjoy Sonic games without trying to screw around with the momentum-based physics, but I can't help but feel like at minimum if you're going to have Classic Sonic in 2D, you should probably have some kind of momentum-based control. But honestly, my biggest gripes during this game involved when I was controlling Dean, and anytime wisps popped up. Dude, I don't know what wisps are or where they came from. Well, okay, I know, but for the sake of this video, I'll pretend I don't know because I haven't played Sonic Colors yet. And I'm not opposed to having varying control styles, differing objectives, or random power-ups. But when there's a different character that is meant to control differently than Sonic, or if there's a power-up involved or something context-sensitive that pops up during a stage, I'd at least like to not have to think about it while playing. It should be seamless. Often I found myself trying to figure out how Dean would react to a certain environmental change, or whether or not I was using the correct wisp and why my character wasn't flinging up into the air or whatever. It got a bit frustrating more often than I care to admit. I'd be willing to relegate this critique down to the fact that I only really played through most stages once, and Sonic games get more enjoyable on repeat playthroughs, but you'd think after the second or even third or fourth level I wouldn't have these issues anymore, but I still did. So that leads me to believe it's a design flaw in the game rather than an issue on my end. But aside from finding myself guessing on the use of Dean's item attachments or troubleshooting with the wisps, I'd say the gameplay in this game suffices. I've seen people talk about being able to cheese through most of the game by just boosting to win, and I'm not sure if that's an issue in the other Boost games, but I could see it being an issue in this game. It wasn't an issue for me because I was just trying to casually play through it and I didn't think much of it. But if I wanted to go out of my way to boost through most of the game, I'm sure I'd have no issues doing so. Still, boosting is kinda cool. The fast-paced nature behind pulverizing everything in the pathway is exhilarating. So even if it's just more of a spectacle in the series littered with spectacles, it's not necessarily out of place. This game all around could do with difficulty balancing though. Some stages and encounters felt like I could have accomplished them with my eyes closed, while other moments in the game would make me repeat them repeatedly to beat. This was consistent with trying to S-rank too. The challenge per stage felt all over the place. I like me a bit of challenge in my Sonic games, but I also like a proper difficulty curve that knows when to make a game challenging, and I don't think this game does a good job at that. Sonic Forces base game hits you with 30 stages. It's a short journey to get through the end of the game. I think it took me about 4 hours to run through, with over an hour of that being the challenging final boss fights. The stages come with red rings and S-rank challenges too, which vary in difficulty but are all around simple if you can just put in a bit of effort. This is largely because many of the stages are straightforward without too many alternative routes or hidden areas. While playing Sonic Frontiers, I remember putting in an effort to find a hidden red ring more than just a few times. Whereas in Forces, it seemed like they were for the most part just on the main path, with only a few forks in the routes. I don't think a Sonic game is necessarily required to have multiple routes, but I do think a good Sonic game is often made better when there are multiple routes, in which the more difficult to reach route rewards you. Whether that reward is a red ring, a shortcut, or a special item doesn't really matter. What's important is there's an incentive to explore and try the harder to reach routes that I didn't really feel existed in Forces. The levels were still fun for a first time run through, but easily get old and offer little reason to replay since getting all of the red rings and S rankings aren't all that difficult. You start off in Green Hill and it's a good intro level to get you used to modern Sonic's control and how the game plays in general. Your boost meter will fill up with a wisp, and the stage is pretty straightforward and hits you with that perfect amount of nostalgia when it transitions into 2D sections. Playing this game in 2017 was so far removed from Generations that I think people complaining about the same aesthetic being used was unreasonable. Especially considering that's the first level in a Sonic game and it's basically a tutorial. It also has a neat transition to a barren desert. Despite hearing people for years scoff at Sonic pointing out that it looks like Sand Hill, I think the fact that the stage transitions the way it does fits well with the story and highlights the danger the world is in. You can tell something is up early on. You then move on to a chemical plant themed stage, but I think it does a better job being different than most chemical plant stages. Regardless, it taught me how to use Dean the Bear and was a good introduction to his character. The Ghost Town is your third stage, and at this point you get a feel for classic Sonic and how he controls it a bit differently than modern Sonic. Once again, this is basically another introductory stage, but at this point you've now had 3 different stage settings in what is basically an introduction, and it bodes well for what's to come. Except stage 4 puts you into the Death Egg, with Dean the Bear again. But the Death Egg looks and feels too similar to Chemical Plant stage you played with Dean in stage 2. Before moving on to a boss fight against Zavik, which I think is pretty good for a first boss fight. I like the boss fights in this game. I have virtually no complaints about them. Stage 6 gives you the same Death Egg aesthetic, but this time with modern Sonic. Stage 7 takes you back to the Sandy area. At this point, I was really beginning to worry that the game was going to be super repetitive as it continued. But thankfully, I got an interesting gimmick where I was now controlling both modern Sonic and Dean the Bear, while all of a sudden entering a pyramid and facing a new aesthetic. Stage 8 throws you in a jungle with a cool QTE involving a giant snake, followed by a boss fight against Infinite, which again, I think does a good job as far as boss fights are concerned. And then stage 10 throws you back into Green Hill, except this time with classic Sonic. And well, yeah, if you want to complain at Green Hill's overuse now, I wouldn't blame you. I don't think you needed 2 different Green Hill levels in the first 10 stages. The stage itself is fun, but the aesthetic does make it feel a bit redundant. But I once again did like the boss battle that followed it. City Park followed with Dean the Bear, and I enjoyed the new environment provided as we neared the halfway point of the game. And I thought it was neat that Stage 13's Mystic Jungle with classic Sonic is where they decided to shoehorn the mandatory casino gimmick. But then after that, it was just a Mystic Jungle with 3D aesthetics. Albeit with the use of Sonic and Dean, and I found it odd that they didn't spread out the jungle stages so that it didn't feel too repetitive. Now, if you take everything I just said and duplicate it, you have the second half of the game. Sure, you have 1 or 2 new environments pop up, but considering how short this game was, I think it was a bit weird that they didn't do a better job making the levels feel more unique. And again, I want to reiterate that I don't think that the stages are necessarily bad. They just feel too repetitive and lack the uniqueness that I would expect from a 3D Sonic title that isn't an open world game like Frontiers was. It is most definitely a disappointing aspect of this game, and if it's a trope that I see continuing as I move back towards the early games, I'll have a better idea of whether it's an issue with Sonic Forces or Sonic as a whole. I don't mind that they use Green Hill or Chemical Plant like most people seem to. The issue while playing this game for me from start to end is that too much of it feels like it repeats itself. Episode Shadow was 3 stages. It gave a bit more background to the story, allowed you to play as Shadow, and was done before I could finish writing the sentence. I'm only mentioning it so I don't forget it. It was forgettable, but the DLC does allow you to play the main stages as Shadow, which is cool. I'd have loved to have seen him integrate into the main story though. I'm a big fan of Shadow in general as a character, so it's too bad he was an afterthought. And I say that fully aware that I'm about to go through over a decade of games where he's an afterthought. If someone was to ask me if I enjoyed Sonic Forces and if they should give it a shot, I'd answer yes to both of those questions without any hesitation. While the story and dialogue, if taken too seriously, could turn someone away, if you take it as it's meant to be taken, lightheartedly, I think you'd enjoy it as much as I did. The game is definitely easy in a lot of areas, but certain moments near the end of the game did give me that huge sense of accomplishment one could only feel while overcoming a difficult endgame. A feeling in which I associate quite a bit to the classic Sonic games. There are a lot of things to love about this game, and really, the only thing I can think of that is worth hating is those moments involved with wisps or random control of Dean the Bear that just felt like it didn't flow properly with the game. Everything else was a minor enough critique that I didn't really feel it ruined the experience for me. But ultimately, Sonic Forces is not my favorite Sonic game. It doesn't have my favorite story. It is, in a lot of ways, forgettable, but it's not a bad game. In fact, it's a good game. While playing through this game, I was expecting an absolute nightmare. I've heard so much negativity talked about it over the past few years that I thought I'd struggle to even get through the game. But somewhere along the line, I realized the real issue with Sonic Forces is that Sonic fans hold the blue blur in such a high regard that the critiques that I pointed out through this video, that I view as a slight nuance, for them make the game unplayable and the downfall of the series. And well, I can't question people's intentions, I don't live inside their heads, but I do think Sonic Frontiers has released in a much more positive era of Sonic, and as a result, the slight nuances of that game are considered slight nuances, despite certain coming-of-age YouTubers attempting to blow those nuances out of the proportions too. I think if Sonic Forces released today, it'd be treated the same way Sonic Frontiers was. It'd have its detractors and haters still, that's inevitable, but I think there'd be a larger vocal online fanbase that would speak higher about it because all of the mainstream opinions ruin the game for everyone. Or I just don't know what I'm talking about and I'm being too easy on it. Either way, I didn't enjoy Sonic Forces as much as Sonic Frontiers, but I did enjoy it, and I enjoyed it enough to make this video defending it. I look forward to all of the young 8 or 9 year olds to release their videos in a decade from now defending this game and having a much more concise opinion of why the game is good than I ever could. Just like the current 20ish year olds have made us view Sonic Unleashed as a masterpiece, even though it was hated more than Forces ever was during the first 10 years of its life. Maybe I'll change my mind about Forces as I continue moving through the series in reverse. Maybe the game leading up to it was so good that this was indeed the death of Sonic. I have a feeling that's not going to be the case though, because next time I'll be looking at Sonic Boom, The Rise of Lyric. And well, I'm not sure if it'll be possible to not judge this book by its cover. But don't forget to like and subscribe to be kept in the loop for the release of that video. As always, thanks for watching. Dean, out.